Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing the realm of vanishing cultures. I'm Tim Weiskell, a member of the Forum's board. For the last 37 years, the Cambridge Forum has been bringing you public live discussions of issues and ideas that are shaping our world. The United States uses a disproportionate share of the world's resources to maintain its current fuel-inefficient lifestyle, a practice that threatens not only the world's ozone layer and its climate, but also its inhabitants and the cultures that have developed over centuries. What do we lose when local languages and economies disappear? How is the impact of global forces on vanishing cultures different today from centuries past? How can we ensure that cultural and biological diversity won't vanish forever? Here to discuss these vital questions and many others you may pose is National Geographic Explorer in Residence and best-selling author Wade Davis. An anthropologist and botanical explorer, Wade Davis spent more than 3 years in the Amazon rainforests and in the Andes Mountains, living among 15 indigenous groups in 8 Latin American countries while making some 6,000 botanical collections. Author of the international bestseller, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Davis's most recent book is Light at the Edge of the World, a journey through the realm of vanishing cultures. In it, he takes us around the globe, visiting ancient cultures from rainforests in Amazonia to the deserts of Burkina Faso. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Wade Davis.
Thank you, Timothy. And it's wonderful to be here with so many old friends who I see in the audience. You know, one of the intense pleasures of travel, as I'm sure many of you have discovered, is the opportunity to spend time amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which we are born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of intellectual and adaptive choices that our lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is the nomadic Penang in the forests of Borneo, the Voodoo acolytes in Haiti, the yak herders in the slopes of Chomolungma, goddess mother of the world, all of these other peoples teach us that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of being, other ways of orienting yourself on the planet. And this is an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad cultures of the world make up an intellectual, spiritual, social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as indeed is the biological web of life that you know as the biosphere. And you might think of this cultural web of life as being an ethnosphere. And you could define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, myths and ideas, intuitions and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can be as a wildly creative and imaginative species. And just as the biological web of life is being severely eroded with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of species of plant and animal, so too is the ethnosphere. But if anything, at a far more severe rate. No biologist, for example, could dare suggest that 50% of all species of plant and animal are moribund or on the brink of extinction, because it is simply not true. And yet that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of us in this room were born, there were 6,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language is not simply a body of vocabulary or a set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of spiritual possibilities. And of those 6,000 languages that were spoken in the year that all of us in this room were born, fully half today are not being taught to children. They're not being whispered into the ears of babies, which means that effectively, unless something changes, they're already dead. And this means by definition that we're living through a time when by any objective criterion, half of humanity's intellectual, spiritual, social, philosophical legacy is being lost in a single generation. Now, there are many people who say, well, wouldn't it be a good thing if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't it be easier to get along? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? And my answer to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that language Lakota Sioux. Let's make it Cantonese. Let's make it Tibetan. Let's make it Yoruba. Let's make it Creole. And suddenly you begin to understand what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means to pass on the wisdom of your ancestors or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight is indeed the fate of somebody somewhere on earth roughly every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder dies and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. And the real question then is, what exactly is at stake? We in the West, being like all great cultures, fiercely ethnocentric, fiercely loyal to our own interpretation of reality, have this great kind of conceit that while we've been indulging technological wizardry, all these other cultures have been somehow dormant. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We now know it to be true biologically, what we've always dreamed to be true philosophically, which is that we're all brothers and sisters. This is now an indisputable biological fact, which means that every culture shares the same raw intellectual curiosity, the same mental acuity. And whether that genius is put into technological prowess or into unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth is simply a matter of choice and orientation. So what then is being lost when these cultures fade away? Well, not too long ago I found myself in a Buddhist monastery perched like a swallow's nest on the edge of the Himalaya, just across the Tibetan frontier in Nepal, in the midst of this extraordinary Baroque ceremony. And my anthropological colleague who was with me told me an extraordinary story of how Bill Gates' father had also visited that monastery. Naturally, I had to walk. He took a helicopter. But he had walked into that prayer hall to be enveloped in all the sensory inspiration of that 2,000-year-old science of the mind. He spun on his heels, walked out, and dismissively said, "What a waste of a human life." Now, who was he, growing up in some suburb of Tacoma, who was fortunate enough to sire a brilliant kid who dropped out of Harvard, who probably played golf on the weekends? Who was he to cast judgment on a tradition that reached back in Central Asia for 2 millennia? So what is it that I mean by this notion of other ways of being? Well, let's slip for a moment into the African reality, the realm of the spirit enveloped by Voodoo. Voodoo, of course, is not a black magic cult. It's interesting. If I asked you to name the great religions of the world, what would you say? Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. There's always one continent left out, sub-Saharan Africa, the tacit assumption being that black people had no religion. Well, of course, by ethnographic fact, they did. And Voodoo is not some kind of black magic cult. It's a complex metaphysical realm worldview. It's simply the distillation of these very profound religious ideas that came over during the tragic diaspora and became sown in the fertile soil of the New World. In many ways, it's a quintessentially democratic faith, because the believer not only has dialogue with the spirit realm, he or she actually becomes the God. As the Voodooists like to say, you white people go to church and speak about God. We dance in the temple and become God. And for the people who live in Benin and Togo, or Dahomey as it was once known, or indeed in Bahia in Cuba or in Haiti, these are people who walk in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and impunity that astonishes the ethnographic observer. And once someone is catapulted into the realm of the spirit, they become the God. And one of the extraordinary things that one witnesses is voodoo acolytes in a state of trance, handling burning coals, for example, with impunity. An astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. And what about realms of the social sphere? Move for a moment into the forests of Sarawak, into the homeland of the Penang, the last nomadic peoples of Borneo. In a nomadic society, sharing becomes an involuntary reflex, because you never know who will be the next to bring food to the table. In a culture where all material possessions have to be carried on the back, what is a measure of wealth? What is the currency of the society? Well, the currency of the society is the strength of the social relationships that exist between people, because if those ties are fractured, the entire society will fall apart. Move for a minute into the forests of the northwest Amazon, to the homeland of the Barasana, a people of the anaconda who believed that mythologically they came up the milk rivers from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent, only to be regurgitated on the various affluents of the northwest Amazon. A people who cognitively do not distinguish the color blue from the color green, because the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the rainforest. Slip west into the homeland of the Warani, an extraordinary rainforest people who were first peacefully contacted in 1958, 5 years after I was born. A year before, 5 missionaries attempted contact and made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8 by 10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we would say culturally to be friendly gestures, postures, forgetting that these people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. And so they picked up these photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to find the form to the figure, found nothing, and concluded that these were calling cards from the devil. And thus they speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Warani didn't just spear outsiders, they speared each other. 54% of the mortality was due to them spearing each other. We traced genealogies back 8 generations and found 2 instances of natural death. And we pursued it a little bit. They admitted that one of the fellows had gotten so old that he died getting old, so we speared him anyway. But on the other hand, they had a perspicacious knowledge of the forest that was astonishing. Their hunters could smell urine at 40 paces in the rainforest and tell you what species had left that behind. And that knowledge of the forest, that intuition about the nature of biology in that natural realm, translated, of course, into this extraordinary knowledge of plants, whether it was knowledge of the barabascos, these curious ichthyotoxins that are used as a means of fishing, or the curaries of flying deaths, the plants that have these muscle relaxants, D-tube or curare, which revolutionized surgery in the West when introduced in the 1940s. Or if we move adjacent to the homeland of the Warani, to the great poison makers of the Amazon, the Kofan, and you begin to work with the shaman, and you embrace the wonder of this curious preparation, ayahuasca, the vision vine, the vine of the soul. This is the most powerful of all the entheogenic or hallucinogenic preparations of the shaman's repertoire. And its sheer dazzling pharmacological effects are extraordinary, but actually of less interest than the wonder of the genesis of the preparation. It's not a single plant, it's a combination of plants. On the one hand, you have a nondescript woody liana, scientifically known as Banisteriopsis capi, which has a series of beta-carbolines in it, including harmine and harmaline, which are mildly psychotropic. They kind of bring on hues of blue and gray that sweep over your imagination. But in addition to the liana, is added the leaves of a nondescript shrub in the coffee family known as Psychotria verdus, which is chock full of tryptamines, which are very close to brain serotonin. 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine, If you've ever seen those wonderful photographs of the Yanomami blowing ebene, the snuff up their noses, this is derived similarly from a series of different species in a different genera and a different family of plants, but with the same key compounds. And to have that snuff blown up your nose is rather like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It creates not the distortion of reality, it creates a total disillusion of reality. In fact, I used to argue with my great professor here at Harvard, Richard Evans Schultes, that you couldn't classify these as hallucinogens because by the time you're under the influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucinations. But the fascinating thing is that those tryptamines are orally inactive. You could eat gallons of the stuff and nothing would happen to you because they're denatured by an enzyme found naturally in the human gut called monoamine oxidase. They can only be potentiated if taken in conjunction with some other herb that denatures MAO. It turns out that the beta-carbolines in the woody liana are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines in the shrub. So you have to ask yourself a question. How in a flora of 80,000 species did the Indian people learn to combine these two unrelated plants in this powerful synergistic way to create the pharmacological equivalent of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? Science says trial and error, which is quickly exposed statistically to be a meaningless euphemism. You ask the Indians and they say, don't you know anything about botany? And you say, evidently not. And they say, well, the plants teach us. What do you mean? In the Siona Sequoia, the third society adjacent to the Kofan and the Warani, have 17 unique varieties of Banisteriopsis caapi that are all referable to our botanical eye as being the same species. And you ask them, how do you distinguish these at great distances in the forest? And they say, well, evidently you clearly do know nothing. And the answer is that you take each one on the night of a full moon and it sings to you in a different key. Now that's not going to get you a PhD at Harvard, but it's a lot more interesting than counting stamens. And this gives you a first intuition about different ways of relating to the environment. You know, whenever we think of indigenous people and try to understand their relationship to nature, we always make the proverbial mistake of either invoking Rousseau and the old canard about the noble savage, or even worse perhaps, we invoke Henry David Thoreau and try to suggest that these indigenous people somehow were more contemplative than we are. Well, I've never met an indigenous society that was either nostalgic or weakened by sentiment. There's not a lot of room for either in the malarial swamps of the Asmat or in the chilling winds of Tibet or in the ice flows of the high Arctic. But indigenous people have nevertheless forged through time and ritual a traditional mystique of the earth that is based not on a self-conscious idea of being close to it, but on a far subtler intuition. And that is the idea that the earth itself can only exist because it is breathed into being, filtered into being by the human imagination. What do I mean by that? I was raised in the rainforests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That made me different than my colleagues amongst the Kwakiutl, who believed that those forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwell at the north end of the world. And more importantly, it gave me a different relationship to that natural environment than they had. A young kid in the high Andes raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu spirit that will direct his or her destiny will have a profoundly different relationship to that mountain than a kid from Montana that believes that a mountain is a pile of inert rock ready to be mined. And you begin to see how this plays itself out in ritual. If we move for a minute to the mountains of the high Andes, for 30 years I've worked in a village outside of Cusco called Chinchero, site of the summer palace of Topa Inca Yupanqui, the second of the great Incan rulers. And believe me, these men had their choice of real estate. And it's a stunningly beautiful valley. But once each year, each hamlet appoints the fleetest young boy to be transformed into a figure known as a wailaka. It's a transvestite figure. He puts on women's clothes, and carrying the banners of his community, he leads all able-bodied men on extraordinary ritual run. You begin at 11,500 feet. You run at a full run, 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain Antakilka. You then run up to 15,000 feet, only to run away off the backside of the mountain for 3,000 feet, only to soar another 3,000 feet, 25 kilometers like this over the course of a long day. And of course, the circumference of the route is marked by holy mounds of earth, itos, huitos, where prayers are uttered, where libations of alcohol are blown to the wind, where coca is given to Pachamama. And of course, the whole metaphor is that by the end of the day, through pure exhaustion, the individuals have fused themselves into community to emerge from the mountains as a single entity who once again have defined their sense of place on the planet. And this metaphor of landscape reaches in South America its most perfect elaboration in the homeland of the Kogi, the Wiwa, and the Ika, the survivors of El Dorado, the descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia, and the wake of the wave of pestilence and conquest that swept over their lives in the 16th century, they retreated to an isolated volcanic massif called the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, where to this day they are still ruled in a blood-stained continent by a ritual priesthood. But the training for the priesthood is rather astonishing. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in the shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, 2 9-year periods in caves or stone huts, 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation they spend in their natural mother's womb. Now they are metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother. And for that entire time, the world only exists as an abstraction, as they are enculturated in the values of their society, values that maintain the proposition that their prayers and their prayers alone maintain the cosmic balance. And at the end of this arduous initiation, suddenly one day they are taken out from the darkness, from the shadowy darkness, and for the first time in their lives they see a sunrise. In that crystal moment of awareness of first light, everything they have learned in the abstract is affirmed in stunning glory. And the priest who has trained them steps back and says, "You see, it's as I've told you. It is that beautiful. It's yours to protect." Now, I could echo the profundity of that revelation in 1,000 societies around the world. The Mazatec, who have a vocabulary based on the wind, whistle speech that allows them to communicate across the expanses of their mountainous homeland in Oaxaca. The Polynesian seafarers, who could sense the presence of a distant atoll, though it lay beyond the horizon, by simply measuring the reverberation in the waves off the bow of their boats. Or if we slipped into the dream time of the Aboriginal people of Australia, you begin to understand why they moved lightly on the land for 60,000 years, because the world for them existed in 2 completely parallel universes. The world of the phenomenological realm, where a rock was a rock, a chair was a chair, a person was a person, but also the world of the dreaming, which was not a dream, as the Europeans label it, but a parallel universe, so that when a young lad went on the walkabout and walked along the song lines, he was in fact replicating the itinerary of the ancestral beings who had sung the world into being at the dawn of time. And his movement through sacred geography was both a literal journey through space and a metaphorical journey through the entire history of his people. And as he walked the song line, the world around him both existed and yet was waiting to be born. And so the rock at his feet, existed, but was still taking shape, dreamed into being by his imagination. And you suddenly understand why it was that people in 60,000 years moved so lightly on the earth. Because how do you begin to indulge a cult of progress in a world that hasn't taken form? It would be like a mother trying to improve the SAT scores of her embryo while it still lay dormant in the womb. Now, when you begin as an anthropologist, as so many wonderful people here at Harvard, cultural survival, have been celebrating for years, and then you see what indeed is sweeping around the world, one is only sort of confronted with tragedy. The 20th century will not be remembered for its wars or its technological innovations, but rather as the era in which we stood by and either actively endorsed or passively accepted the massive destruction of both biological and cultural diversity on the planet. Now, the problem is not change. All peoples through all times have been adapting to new possibilities for life. The problem is not technology. The Sioux did not stop being Sioux when they gave up the bow and arrow for the rifle, any more than an American farmer stopped being an American when he gave up the horse and buggy for the automobile. The problem is neither change nor technology, it's power, the crude face of domination. And wherever you look around the world, these are not quaint and colorful cultures destined to fade away as if by some natural law, as if they're failed attempts at modernity. These are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces, whether it's egregious deforestation in the homeland of the Penang, the disease elements have swept into the forests of the Yanomami, or the ideological forces which dominate from Beijing the people of Tibet. And this realization that human beings are in fact the agents of cultural destruction is actually an optimistic observation, because it suggests that if we indeed are the agents of cultural destruction, we can also be the facilitators of cultural survival. Genocide, the physical extermination of a people, is universally condemned. Ethnocide, the destruction of a people's way of life, is not only not condemned around the world, in many quarters it's still promoted as appropriate policy of the nation state. And in the end, then, we really have a choice. What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a monochromatic world of monotony, or do we want to embrace a polychromatic world of diversity? Margaret Mead said before she died that her greatest nightmare was that as we drifted toward this sort of blandly amorphous generic worldview, not only would the entire realm of the human intellect be progressively reduced to a more narrow modality of thought, but that we would wake one day as from a dream, having forgotten that there were even other possibilities. The human species has been around as a recognizable social form for at least 100,000 years. The Neolithic Revolution, at which time, as Joseph Campbell said, we succumbed to the cult of the seed, when the poetry of the shaman was displaced by the prose of the priesthood, when we invented surplus, hierarchy, specialization, was only 10,000 years ago. Modern industrial society, as we know it, is scarcely 300 years old. That doesn't suggest to me that we have all of the answers for all of the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. Now, all cultures, of course, are fiercely ethnocentric, loyal to their own interpretation of reality. The word barbarian derives from the Greek barbarus, meaning one who babbled. And if you didn't speak the Greek language, you didn't exist. The Aztec had the same notion with their language, Nahuatl. This cultural myopia is no longer something we can afford to indulge. The anthropological lens is useful as a way to begin to put all of this in perspective. If, for example, an anthropologist was to arrive in America from afar, he or she would see many wondrous things. And if the measure of technological prowess was a measure of success, clearly the Western culture as we know it, whatever this odd amalgam is, would come out on top. But if we began to look at the social sphere, we'd see that we're many things, but we're most certainly not the paragon of humanity's potential. We say that we revere marriage, but we allow half our marriages to end in divorce. We say that we love our children, but we embrace an obscene slogan 24/7, implying total dedication to the workplace, and then we're wondering why the average father spends so little time with his children, or why indeed the average American lad has spent 2 years watching television by the age of 18. We say that we love our elders, but only 6% of American homes are prepared to have grandparents living with grandchildren under the same roof. Add to that an economic form of activity that by any scientific definition compromises the integrity of the biosphere, and you suddenly see we're many wondrous things, but we're not the paragon of humanity's potential. And these other cultures are not failed attempts at modernity. On the contrary, with their dreams and prayers, their myths and memories, they teach us that there are indeed other ways of being, alternative visions of life, death, and creation itself. And when asked the meaning of being human, they respond with 10,000 different voices. And it's within this diversity of knowledge and practice of intuition and interpretation of promise and hope that we can all rediscover the enchantment of being what we are, a conscious species aware of our place on the planet and fully capable of ensuring that all peoples in all gardens find a way to flourish. The goal is not to freeze indigenous people in time like some kind of biological specimen. One cannot make, even if you wanted to, a rainforest park of the mind. The goal is to find a way to generate truly pluralistic societies in which all human populations have a right to engage and benefit from the wonder of human ingenuity without that engagement having to imply the eradication of who they are as a people. Because in the end, we need all of these visions, because for all of us, they stand apart as symbols of the geography of hope. Now, the wonderful thing is that there has been a sea change in attitude vis-a-vis the rights, responsibilities, potential, hopes, and dreams of Indigenous people. I grew up in Canada at a time when the Inuit of the High Arctic were still dismissed as being primitive embarrassments to the nation state. Indeed, when the British first came to the High Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong, but one did more to honor the human race. And what the British failed to understand was that there could be no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in that harsh environment on a technology that was limited to what you could carve from bone, stone, slate, and small bits of wood that floated up from the sea like flotsam. When the Europeans mimicked the ways of the Inuit, they achieved great feats of exploration. When they failed to do so, they suffered terrible deaths. When the last of Lord Franklin's men were found dead at Starvation Cove on the Adelaide Peninsula, they were found with the sailors frozen to death in the leather traces of the sled. They were trying to drag behind them an oak and iron sled that weighed 900 pounds. On it was a dory from the ship that weighed 500 pounds. Inside the dory were all the accoutrements of a British naval officer's dinner service, including a copy of the novel The Vicar of Wakefield. This somehow they expected to drag through the boreal forests of northern Canada with the hope that they might bump into a Hudson Bay post and achieve salvation. Well, they suffered a terrible death. But the Inuit were not like that. They moved lightly on the land. And when I went narwhal hunting at the tip of Baffin Island once with a group of Inuit people from Arctic Bay, one of them told me a marvelous story from his grandfather. In the 1950s, in an effort to establish our sovereignty in Canada, we forced the Inuit into settlements. This old man categorically refused to go. The family, fearful for his life, took away all of his weapons, all of his tools, thinking that that would force him into the settlements. Did it? No. In the middle of an Arctic night, with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped out of the igloo, pulled down his caribou hide and sealskin trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces began to froze, he forged a shit knife. As the blade took shape, he put a spray of saliva along the edge to make a sharp edge, and as the shit knife took final form, he used it to butcher a dog. He skinned the dog with it, improvised a harness with the skin of the dog, improvised a sled with the rib cage of that dog, harnessed up an adjacent dog, and then shit knife and belt disappeared over the ice floes. Talk about getting by with nothing. And that, in many ways, has become a symbol of the redemption of the Inuit people, a hope that was realized and rewarded by the Canadian government in April of 1999 when the Inuit, in an extraordinary gesture for a nation state, took control of an area of land the size of California and Alaska put together. It's a new homeland of the Inuit people called Nunavut, the newest territory of Canada, and 26,000 Inuit people now have total control of a landscape half the size of Western Europe. Now, in the end, these issues of anthropology, perhaps sentimental and romantic when I was a student, have become an issue of national survival. One of the things that anthropology teaches is that culture is not decorative. Culture is not about bells and whistles and feathers. Culture is a blanket of security that you place around you to make sense out of sensation. It's the way that the individual finds meaning in an ultimately meaningless universe. It is the way that we reach, as Lincoln suggested, always for the better angels of our nature. And one thing anthropology teaches is if you strip away culture and the individual survives, then madness and anarchy awaits. And throughout the world today, because of the processes of globalization, the shift to the cities, the fantasy that we've promoted, that indigenous people and people throughout the world, if they only follow the dictates of our economic model, will somehow achieve our level of affluence. And of course, what happens is by their own volition or through betrayal or through coercion, they turn their backs on their past, move forward, and only secure a place in the bottom rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere. Stripped of their past, they drift to the cities that become these vast seas of misery. And out of those pools of wretched life emerge these strange revitalization movements, whether it's the Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century in China, the Shining Path in Peru, the Maoists in Nepal, or the Al-Qaeda fantasy of an Islamic world of the 7th century that never existed, but has to be presumed to exist to rationalize their mania. You suddenly see that culture is not trivial. It is indeed the key to civilization. So the quest to maintain the integrity of the ethics and the values that have inspired peoples through all time no longer lies in the realm of anthropology. It lies in the realm of survival and, of course, in the realm of hope. Thanks very much.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Wade Davis, The Realm of Vanishing Cultures. Well, you've posed a lot of very challenging issues, and one is that we have to rethink, in a sense, the cultures you've encountered, if we haven't yet encountered them. And instead of looking at them, as you labeled it, as failed attempts at modernity, they stand, in a sense, as a statement that modernity is a failed attempt at humanity. I mean, in some sense, they stand to challenge what's been achieved since the Neolithic, basically. I mean, in effect, agricultural civilizations have a very different relationship to the world than those you've been discussing. And in many respects, anthropologists are often accused of saying it's all been downhill since the agricultural revolution. Would you go that far? Would you say, in a sense, our sense of immediacy in the world as human beings has been lost since we manipulate plants for our survival?
I don't think really any serious anthropologist would agree with that. I mean, I think, anthropology has sort of been often accused of many things that the profession does not actually endorse. One of them is sort of the idea that anthropologists embrace a kind of extreme relativism, as if any human behavior can be excused, as if the heinous acts of the Nazis, for example, could be rationalized because, after all, they had a religion, a language, and ideology. The whole point of anthropology is not to eliminate judgment, but rather to call for the suspension of judgment so that the ethical judgments we're obliged to make can be informed ones. No anthropologist would fail to condemn the egregious violations of humanity that the Nazis represented. But the anthropological lens comes most usefully into focus when it's directed toward those cultures that have been unjustly pilloried for beliefs that we simply do not understand. And the ultimate example, for me at least, is the way that voodoo has been portrayed in the world. Have you ever thought, where did we get this crazy idea that voodoo is a black magic cult? Where did that come from? Until the turn of the 20th century, the only real references to voodoo were its role that it played ideologically in the most successful and the only successful slave revolt in history. And then the U.S. Marine Corps occupied Haiti between 1920 and 34, whatever it was, about 15 years, and everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. And the books had names like Black Baghdad, Cannibal Cousins, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, A Puritan Voodoo Land, The Magic Island, The White King of La Gonave, and the books gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead, Zombies on Broadway, Zombies of the Stratosphere, and all of these books and all these films were filled with children bred for the cauldron, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, pins and needles in dolls that didn't exist. And they essentially said to the American people during the era of Jim Crow that any country where such abominations occurred could only find its redemption in military occupation. And that's really the genesis of our notion of voodoo as being something evil. I think anthropology would never suggest that life somehow, social life, ceased at the Neolithic. On the contrary, I mean, there's this incredible sense in celebration anthropology that culture is constantly changing, constantly evolving. And what anthropology tries to suggest is that the worldview that we happen to have inherited is not the only worldview. It indeed may not even be the most vibrant worldview, and it certainly should not be a worldview that is imposed by whatever force on the other diverse facets of the human imagination, which together make up the human collective.
Right. I mean, one of your most compelling points is, in a sense, the restatement of the biological assertion of the diversity stability hypothesis, that we will continue as stable species to the extent that we tolerate diversity. If we become sort of monocoherent and collapse into a universal sameness, we're very vulnerable.
Well, the biological analogy is very apropos. Of course, through history, the history of the Earth, species have come and gone. Extinction is a natural phenomenon. But in general, over the last 600 million years, speciation, the creation of new forms of life, has outpaced extinction. By the same token, languages have come and gone. We don't speak Assyrian anymore. We don't speak Babylonian. But in general, in the past, languages have had time to leave descendants. We don't speak Latin in the streets of Rome. Before Latin faded away as a general language, it left in its wake the Romance languages. Now, both in the biological realm and in the cultural realm, species and cultures are disappearing at a rate that is simply unprecedented.
And making us more vulnerable. In effect, we've all started to become speakers of Microsoft, and we just learned today that Microsoft's operating systems have a big bug in them. But, that is, we could become hyper-coherent to the point of collapse.
But this idea that technology is the threat, again, is not something I think most anthropologists would endorse. I think the Internet, for example, has been an incredible tool of liberation. We at Cultural Survival have colleagues amongst the Maasai who walk 3 days to get online for half an hour. When I tried to set up an article for the National Geographic amongst the last band of nomadic Penang in the forests of Sarawak, I did it through a satellite feed on the Internet. In other words, technology is not the threat. Politics and power may be. And, if you go throughout the world, actually the Internet is allowing these people to break their isolation. And you have the Kayapo speaking to the Inuit, and you talk to Kogi, and you suddenly have this amazing dialogue happening, which has actually been an extraordinary force of empowerment. And, one of the questions you have when you address these issues is what can be done about it. You can't, as I said, make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't sequester an indigenous people in the past like a frozen zoological specimen. But on the other hand, social change does happen, and it happens remarkably fast. If you look back over the last 40 years, who and how can you possibly account for the transformation in the role of women in our society? Attitudes towards homosexuality, attitudes towards the environment itself. There are catalytic moments that you can identify. The invention of the pill, a particularly powerful speech in the realm of civil rights by Martin Luther King. But in general, you can't really pinpoint where it came from. But if we remember that 40 years ago, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was considered a great environmental victory, you realize how far we've come. And as Margaret Mead quite accurately said, to the point of cliche, it really is one mind at a time. So when we at the National Geographic first began to address this issue of culture as part of our overall conservation initiative, we looked around the world and sort of concluded that politicians would never lead us anywhere, that polemics are never persuasive, but we believe that storytelling can change the world. And every month, the National Geographic, we have an audience of 250 million people around the world. And so what we've done there is launched a series of journeys to the ethnosphere, where we're taking our audience to those points of cultural wonder that are so dazzling that just to know about them is to hopefully reflexively even by osmosis, embrace this revelation of anthropology, that these people aren't failed attempts at being us. They're unique expressions of the human heart and imagination. And I think that we're seeing this all around the world. Tribal societies throughout the world that were marginalized, dismissed, even ridiculed, are now suddenly being acknowledged in many ways as key symbols of the patrimony of nations.
You are listening to Wade Davis, The Realm of Vanishing Cultures. The floor is now open, and please address your questions at the central microphone.
Thank you for a stirring lecture. The last word of your lecture was hope, and yet we've heard all evening about what a dismal state it is to be losing cultural and biological species. What do you base that hope on, Wade? I'm with you. I understand, and I hope also. But what is there within human culture that brings that out? Can culture evolve in time to save some of these species that we regret that we're losing?
Well, I think, Katie, that was not a set-up question, but she is one of my best friends, so I should say that. I think we tend to be incredibly impatient with the pace of social change. I mean, Peter Matthewson, who's one of my favorite writers, once said that anyone who thinks they can change the world is both wrong and dangerous. And I think, at some level we just have to be modest enough to recognize that perhaps our best contribution can be in simply bearing witness to what's going on around us. On a more pessimistic note, the most disturbing trait of our species, I think, is the fluidity of our memory and our capacity to forget. How many of us in this room can even imagine a time that was actually within the era of our own great-grandparents, when passenger pigeons, for example, made up 40% of all birds in North America? I mean, Audubon describes getting into his rig in Louisville and seeing the entire sun eclipsed by flocks of birds that were, he estimated, to number 2 and 3 billion birds. When they dropped onto a Midwestern landscape in the late 19th century, oak trees would break off like toothpicks from the weight of the birds. Summer landscapes would become winter landscapes from the accumulation of guano. And yet now we can't even remember the era of the pigeon, passenger pigeon, except in vernacular, like the term stool pigeon, which derives from a killing technique of the era, because the hunters would take a bird, sew its legs to a pole, sew its eyelids shut, put it in the ground, and the cries of grief would bring in the birds in such abundance that they could be batted out of the sky. Who can remember a time in 1871 when buffalo outnumbered people in North America? Who can remember the fact that from the height of the herds to their reduction to a zoological curiosity was not a century due to the inexorable progression of the American frontier? It was 8 years as explicit policy of the U.S. cavalry. And in fact, Philip Sheridan, the Civil War general who orchestrated the destruction of the commissary of the Great Plains tribes, when it was finally done and the last of the buffalo were reduced to a shadow, and when the Indians themselves were reduced to the reservations, he actually recommended to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on the one side of it a dead buffalo and on the other side a dead Indian. So in other words, this amazing inclination to forget is perhaps the most disturbing trait of our species. And one of the things that you try to stress is that these cultural beliefs really make for different options. And we forget that in the West, for good and for bad, we embarked during the Enlightenment on an extraordinary experiment. We liberated the individual from the collective. And that was the sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. And in doing so, we discovered this ideology of personal freedom that all of us are embraced by. But on the other hand, we also gave up the comfort of faith, the comfort of community. And there are clearly consequences to that. Now, one of the things I always wanted to do as sort of an experiment, for example, would be put on a video feed a young girl from the forests of Sarawak, a young Penang child, and link her up with a young kid from Beverly Hills of the same age, and simply ask them 2 questions. Name me everything you own. Well, the kid from Sarawak would take about 13 seconds to get through everything her entire culture owns, because everything must be carried on the back. The kid from Beverly Hills would take 6 months to get through her bedroom. But then you do the follow-up question and say, how many hours today did you spend with your mom and dad? Well, the kid from Borneo wouldn't understand the question because he or she spends every day, all day, with their mother and father because that's how they learn to be human. The kid from Beverly Hills would say, hours with my dad? I think I saw him last Tuesday when he went up to Burbank to cut that deal with Eisner. In other words, the important point is that we make choices, and the choices have consequences. And one of the frightening kind of confluences of historical forces today is the fact that this extraordinary country called America that never sought an empire. Whenever I hear people of the left speak of conspiracies, I as a Canadian say, look, I've never met an American who could keep a secret, let alone mount a conspiracy. This is not a country that sought empire. In 1940, Portugal had a bigger army than the United States. But this is a country from the sheer vitality of its dreams, of its economic system, of its economic dominance, now finds itself in a position of power and influence unprecedented since Rome. At the same time, it's a country that was born from an ideology that said, let's get away from that. And so the cultural myopia that we always criticize is in fact a part of who we wanted to be. I don't really think it's to the detriment of the president that he never went to Paris. But I think we can no longer afford that cultural myopia. You know, my own father-in-law was a U.S. Senator for 18 years. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he came to visit us in Canada. Wonderful, kind man. He had made 70 trips to India, at least 60 trips to the Middle East. Canada is your biggest trading partner. We send 95% of your natural gas imports. We sell more oil to you than Saudi Arabia. By far your biggest trading partner. He had only once before come to Canada. And he came to me at the woodpile, guidebook in hand, and said to me breathlessly, Wade, did you know Canada was the second biggest country in the world? And then he loved newspapers, so from a bush pilot I managed to scam a copy of the Toronto Globe and Mail. One morning at breakfast he was reading it assiduously by the campfire, and he said, Wade, why is there so much news on Canada in this paper? And this is the man who, to his credit, brought down Nixon, but to my horror was almost president. In other words, we can no longer afford that cultural myopia, and it's not just a myopia born of our heritage, it's also a myopia born of our affluence. The 30 million African Americans control more wealth than the 30 million Canadians. We spend more money on our lawns than the nation of India collects in tax revenue. We support a defense budget which is a trivial percentage of our GDP. It's bigger than the economy of Australia. We are wired for the internet, which makes it hard for us to understand a world where most people have never had a phone call, let alone sent an email. Indulged in our affluence, how do we understand a world of 2 billion people that get by on less than $2 a day? But as an anthropologist, that's the world in which I live. And that's the world which now, connected by CNN, connected by global media, is no longer going to tolerate this vast chasm between the haves and the have-nots. The great challenge for the next century is not going to be in the realm of technology. It's going to be finding a way to more equitably share the bounty of the planet, because these people will no longer be silent.
You left us with a call, I guess, to be very aware of all the different cultures that are out there. This seems a challenge to me. I've lived in some other places myself. When I was there, I was very wrapped up in the reality that was there. Here, I find it pretty challenging just to live in my own reality. There's a lot I have to figure out in my own context. And I'm wondering if in your travels you found any groups that have managed not just to be more tolerant of other groups, but have really managed to get that sort of mental connection to all the other cultures so we can look to them as a model. I just feel like it's too hard to live in every world all at once. So I want to know what you think, if there's a model for us out there.
Well, the wonderful thing about anthropology is that all human populations deal with the same fundamental imperatives. They all have children. They all have to educate, feed, and initiate their children. They all have to deal with the inexorable mystery that death represents, and they all have to deal with the wonder of what the world is that lies beyond death. And so you have this, the more you study anthropology and the more cultures you're fortunate to visit, the more you realize how much we indeed have in common. And then the wonder of culture is that given that fundamental set of imperatives, culture can become manifest in, as I said, 10,000 different ways. The truth is, most cultures are ethnocentric. The names of many societies, if you translate them roughly, will always translate as the people. The implication being that all those other people are savages beyond the pale. And, thinking as an anthropologist, I don't think as an American or as a Canadian. I think as just a human being enmeshed in this kind of extraordinary diversity of the human experience. And when I offer an admonition to ourselves, I offer the same admonition to the peoples with whom I found myself living in Tibet or Borneo. The whole point is not to freeze the past, but to answer the question, how are we going to move into a multicultural world of pluralism? How are we going to all benefit from the wonder of innovation without that engagement having to imply the eradication of who we are? Let me give you just one example. Even the key indicators of development, neutral as they may seem to be, can be laden with consequence. Literacy. Who can argue with literacy? How can literacy be bad? Well, on one level, it can never be bad. But if literacy means, as I've seen it to mean amongst the nomadic pastoral peoples of the Kaisut Desert in northern Kenya, whereas one survival strategy, a survival strategy against periodic drought, they endeavor to send, usually a son as it turns out, an elder son to school to acquire a modicum of literacy. On the face of it, there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens, in effect, is that the kid goes into some parochial school, acquires a modicum of literacy, but is also enculturated into a world which teaches him to have contempt for who his father is. So he comes into school as a nomad. He graduates as a clerk. He can't go back. He now enters an economy that has a 60% unemployment rate for high school graduates. So what does he do? Shorn of the foundations of his tradition, having been taught to have contempt for his own father and mother, he then enters an economy that has no place for him. So what does he do? He drifts to Nairobi. And this urbanization, the demographic shift from the hinterland to these urban centers, is one of the key phenomenon of our times. Lima, Peru in 1940 had a population of roughly 500,000. Today it's 13 million, in the middle of an endless desert of misery. Kathmandu in the 1980s had a population of 250,000. It's today 2.5 million. There are cities in China we cannot name that have populations of 20 million people. And the one thing that anthropology teaches is that when people are shorn of tradition, when people are squeezed, shit happens. If you look at the Boxer Rebellion, which I mentioned earlier, at the turn of the 20th century, the Boxers didn't simply kidnap the missionaries. They didn't simply kill the missionaries. They were responding to the humiliation of an ancient nation long the center of the known world that suddenly was subservient to barbarians at the gate. So when they took those missionaries, it wasn't enough to kill them. They had to decapitate them. They had to display their heads on pikes. It was a raw atavistic response. If the Shining Path in Peru had been able to curb its reflexive disdain for the very indigenous people of the Andes that it claimed to represent, they would have indeed have been able to set Peru aflame, as was their intent. Pol Pot killed 35% of his own people with this weird and bizarre post-colonial fantasy of a return to a chimera empire of which he knew nothing. We see this all around the world. Al-Qaeda, the cancer that it is, ought to be expunged from the human record. But it behooves us to understand where they come from. And they're coming out of a place of failure. of humiliation, of dispossession. It's not just that the West has been seen in the Middle East as a compromiser of Islam or as a fountain of vulgar commercial goods. The West has critically in the Middle East been seen as a failure. The Shah of Iran was not driving Islam down the throats of his people. He was driving his fantasy of Paris down their throats. Abdul Nasser was not an Islamicist. He was a Marxist socialist who brought his economy to the tank. So the West in the Middle East, above all, is synonymous with failure. And out of misery comes fantasy. And many times those fantasies are profoundly dangerous to all human populations. And so we have to begin to examine and understand the roots from which these fantasies come, because otherwise they'll continue to pop up. And they fundamentally come, in my opinion, from the misery that the modern world has become for far too many of its citizens.
Wade, there's a Yoruba saying that the world is a market, and it is at markets where different cultures meet and exchanges happen, goods. You suggest that all cultures are ethnocentric, and I challenge that. Like you, I'm a student of Maroon cultures in the diaspora, where I suggest their richness, if you like, their new speciation is precisely multilingual. These are Africans from all cultures in Africa, grafted onto indigenous cultures that they connected with here in Darien very early, 1537, free long before Haiti, independent states recognized. So I think we do have models, don't you think, of lessons in cultural survival and the ways in which we accommodate change. Perhaps you would say some more about Maroon cultures in the world, because you...
You know, when I say that all cultures are ethnocentric, I don't mean to speak in absolutes. I should really have said all cultures can tend towards ethnocentricity, largely because people tend to be fearful of the other or uncertain of the other. You know, again, your comments go back to the whole notion that change is no threat to culture, and that all peoples through all time have constantly been dancing with new possibilities of life. I mean, one of my favorite places to travel in the world is indeed Africa, because this is the one place where you see this constant fusion of past and present, of ethnicity and culture, and the emergence of new forms of living. I mean, again, we get back to this idea that I'm certainly not advocating freezing peoples in the past. What I'm really saying is, how are we really going to live in a pluralistic, multicultural world? And how do we then allow ourselves to get through this period in which there is this condensation and intense level of destruction of both plant and animal species, for that matter, but also of culture? You know, it's almost like I feel like if we can just get through the next 100 years, we're going to open up into this whole new world of interfusion and cultures informing each other. And that's a world that I kind of want to do everything I can to make sure that all the ingredients in that recipe are still there. And, you know, one can talk about changing culture. You can talk about the notion that cultures don't disappear, they just change. But there have been just too many places that I've seen where the crude face of domination within a generation has swept away a people. The Penang in the forests of Borneo. The year that I was born, there were 30,000 Penang. Today, there may be living nomadically in the rainforest. Today, there may be 30 families still managing to do so. Places like the Cofan in eastern Ecuador. I watched how in a single generation the discovery of oil transformed a people who had been living in total isolation into a people who had been completely ravaged. Now, in that case, I've also seen great inspiration and redemption, because in 1973, when I lived with the Penang, I thought they were moribund. But now they've come back. And they've come back, incidentally, in a rather extraordinary way. The Cofan are these great poison makers of the northwest Amazon. They were, my professor here at Harvard, Richard Evans Schulte, a great plant explorer, went in 1941 to study their arrow poisons. They were known to be the great poison makers. And they lived in total isolation. I mean, in 1965, when one of his graduate students went to visit them, they remained virtually isolated in the forest. But there was a couple of missionaries living amongst them. And the missionaries' name were Bub and Bobby Borman. And unbeknownst to the missionaries, as they were evangelizing the Cofan were evangelizing their son. And Randy Borman grew up as a speaker of Cofan, as a hunter in the forest. He tried, because his parents were American, to attend high school in Quito and even a year of college, I think it was in Michigan State. He hated this world, and he went back to the forest, and he married a Cofan woman and had a bunch of kids. Now, the fascinating thing is that the traditional role of the Cofan chief, it was a shamanic role, because in isolation, the greatest threat to the culture, by definition, came from the spirit realm. But with the arrival of the colonists, the arrival of the oil companies, the pollution of the rivers, the usurpation of the land, suddenly the role of the chief became a quintessentially political role. And so the Cofan, absolutely on their own, decided that Randy Borman was to be their chief. Why? Because the challenge now was to go to Quito, to speak Spanish, to speak English, to have this dialogue with this other dark realm of terror, which was analogous in their mind to the realm of spiritual terror that some of the forces of nature had represented. So Randy was made their chief, and he has now progressively, year by year, increased their holdings to the point where the Cofan today control more land than they have since the time of the Inca, who were never able to conquer them. So that to me is this marvelous kind of fusion of culture, and there's nothing more exhilarating than to be in the forest with Randy, because in one moment he is talking to you about his liaisons with the Field Museum and the experiments they're doing to reintroduce caiman and the river turtles to the Rio Agua Rico, and then he suddenly shifts into Cofan, and he's just a hunter of the forest, and his whole worldview is from that place. So cultural fusion is a wonderful thing, but the key thing is that we want to make sure that the raw material of the human potential does not get so severely eroded that that fusion is no longer viable or meaningful.
I have a question about language. You mentioned that when a language dies, that there can be a loss of the philosophical legacy of that people. And I'm wondering to what extent you're suggesting that that's inherent in the language, or if it has to do with the ideas of the people themselves. And I was hoping you could talk a bit more about the current thinking about to what extent the structure of a language can limit or affect the things that people can think about, or if those differences are largely superficial.
Well, I'm not a linguist, so I can't begin to address academic questions of language. And I want to stress that, I've had great arguments with friends of mine from British Columbia and from Alaska from indigenous communities, the Haida, Kwagilth, the Tlingit, the Tahltan, other peoples many of whom have lost their native languages. And they will quite properly say, how dare you suggest that I'm no longer native? Not that I do, but that would be, because I don't speak Tahltan. I think the reason that anthropologists point to language is really not because language in and of itself is necessarily so essential, as much as that it's the obvious canary in a coal mine. It's hard to, whatever this process is by which a culture shifts from being essentially integral to being increasingly assimilated or whatever, language loss clearly is some kind of benchmark. And language loss is also a way to get audiences to pay attention. It's funny, when I speak about these issues and themes, you can begin to talk about abstractions, but when you say to an audience, particularly a lay audience of even school children, how would you feel to not be able to speak English if that's your native tongue? I mean, I happen to love English. I think English is the most beautiful language in the world because it's my language. But I don't want it to be like a cultural nerve gas sweeping over the rest of the world. But language becomes a kind of essential way to get people to pay attention. Whether language is congruent necessarily with culture, I mean, I think people, it's one of those complicated issues. Like, for example, even within the understanding of culture in North America, or South America for that matter, how do we even begin to speak in terms of Aboriginal life when we all recognize that when the diseases of Europe reached the New World, it wasn't decimation, which in Latin means to kill 1 in 10. It was 9 out of 10 Indian peoples, or from the high Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, died of disease within the first 50 years. So that kind of passage of darkness that these civilizations went through is this key crucible beyond which we can almost never really reach. So when I don't try to put too much emphasis on language except as a kind of key benchmark and indicator of where we are today.
Hi. First, before I even ask anything, I just want to say how much I loved Passage Through Darkness. Okay, I've been sitting here and there trying to figure out how to phrase my question. I grew up, I guess I'm kind of a test case myself for the question I have. I grew up in an area of Pennsylvania along the Appalachian Trail when I'm 30 years old. Within my lifetime, I remember quite vividly many people pouring libations of alcoholic cider, hard cider, on their orchards, garters hanging from trees to encourage the trees to grow. We had people literally believing in Ivica Jäger, the eternal hunt, which was like the wild hunt of Europe, all sorts of European customs. People would move in, move out, whatever. It only enriched the culture until the late 80s and on through the 90s, where due to the economic situations, they started bringing people from all over, and it became too fast of a change. The other part of my involvement in life, and the other thing I think in just as naturally, I'm sort of a hybrid person. Candomblé has been part of my life for a long time now. I worry about the African-derived New World religions in that I see the changes, and I'm wondering what your insights to be like. Okay, I was very pleased with its with Voodoo's legalization in Haiti a few years ago. There's also mass marketing now of books on the topics and all sorts of things. I keep wondering how much it will keep it alive and how much it's just going to homogenize it into out of existence, basically. Do you have any insights into that? Or?
I think that part of what we're thinking about here is kind of an article of faith. In other words, how do you fundamentally view diversity? To me, my key motivation, and I think all people in their politics and in their writings ultimately are working out of a place of personal conviction. It just strikes me, and I've always felt this, that diversity is not just the foundation of stability, as the ecologists dryly teach. It's an article of faith. It's a fundamental indicator of the way the world was meant to be. And I just find this kind of drift toward this blandly amorphous generic world culture to be profoundly discouraging. I don't want to live in a monochromatic world of monotony. I just think it's inherently more interesting to live in a world of diversity. Curiosity is what drives one into those realms. I don't think that human beings, complex as they are, will ever cease to be of interest, but at least I think that we have to be aware of these processes. Once we made, as Saul Bellows said, a house cleaning of belief, we began to march down this kind of inspired, but to my mind, somewhat sterile avenue of rationality. And I must say, having been a product of that world, I tend to like to jump into the sea of irrationality whenever I can. And Candomblé is a good place to do that.
Yeah, I've always thought with all the Orisha, it's like each one's its own culture. And so it's just gives way to plurality. But
I just wanted to mention, I heard a lot of people say that we should tolerate diversity, and I just thought tolerate was rather condescending, so I don't know if there's another word choice, but that might be, but my question actually was, there's a belief in some cultures that the universe is like a breath and that it expands and contracts, and at the moment our universe is contracting. And I wondered if from an anthropologist standpoint, maybe is that why culture might be becoming more homogenous, since it started out that way at these, dawn of civilization, we were all one, and then as the mankind, expanded, it became more diverse, and, could that be reflective of that?
I actually think it's kind of, to be honest with you, I think it's sort of a typical human gesture of hubris to compare our own evolutionary history with the history of the universe. I mean, we are a drop in the bucket in terms of time. So I don't think any kind of sense of an expanding, contracting universe has, very much to do with the human experience, which has been so fleeting in terms of time. I mean, that would be my honest answer.
But we are part of the universe, so it could be reflective in other areas, but we're just unknown because we don't know other cultures or other civilizations in the universe. But maybe they all reflect the same. It's just a thought.
Hi, and thank you for that inspiring lecture. I'm a freshman here at Harvard, and I'm still in that phase where I think that we can make a difference in the world and that change can be sort of initiated by individuals. And I was wondering, you say that power and policies and world domination, basically conflict, are what is killing away all of these beautiful civilizations and cultures and languages. But in a way, if we want to change something, how can anthropology help on the policy side through cooperation and promoting hope and understanding, but on a more widespread level than the National Geographic, for example, that already sort of preaches to the converted? Just basically how to make that message more widespread and to hit home where policymakers aren't sort of selling out for campaign elections and pretending to speak to our own problems and not addressing problems of greater sort of meta importance. How can anthropology sort of mesh with political science to make a change and make this world a better place?
Well, I really honestly salute you for your energy and your idealism, and I'm sort of looking at myself 30 years ago, member of SDS, blowing up buildings here at Harvard. I think it's great. Angel, like one of the things that I think that one of the things that happens in life, it's sort of like if you don't have that kind of zeal now, there's really something wrong. It's like I always said, if you're not crazy in your 20s, there's something wrong with you. And if you're still crazy in your 40s, maybe there's something also wrong with you. And one of the things I think you learn in life is that adage of Peter Matthewson, you can't change the world. It's kind of like more like you got to just do your bit, and it's almost like you want to try to take a Hippocratic oath about life itself. And if you can get through life sort of doing no harm, you're probably several steps ahead most of your peer group, And I think that when you get to be the crotchety old age that I am, I just turned 50, which is hard to fathom, for me at least. Hard to believe. But, you really do get into this sort of space where you're thinking, okay, how can I just not do harm? And you can't, that adage that Peter Matthewson said, is so true. I mean, if you think you can change the world, you're wrong and dangerous. I mean, look at all the bloodshed of the 20th century was created by three men who thought they had the monopoly of truth, Hitler, Mao, and Stalin. And it reached bizarre extents with Mao. I mean, if you look at the Great Leap Forward, you can't believe this really happened. But in 1958, And this is at a time when, 10 years later here at Harvard, we had this guy's poster on our walls. It's hard to imagine. But, he suddenly decides statistically China should be the biggest producer of steel. And so he puts out an order for everybody to melt down their plowshares. It really happened. And for 1 year, China was statistically the greatest producer of steel in the world, useless ingots of recycled steel that were never used for anything. But of course, spring rolled around and you had to plow your fields, and there were no plows. And I forget the figure, 30 million people died? And again, all because of this fantasy that, this one man. And so I think that one of the things as you get older is you've got to take all that energy that you have and all those dreams you have and all that idealism you have and keep it in your heart, but then gradually channel it through your life with a certain amount of humility and modesty. So you find that place you put it where A, you're doing no harm, and B, you suddenly wake up one day and you realize you just may have done a little bit of good. And if you can leave this life having done just a little bit of good, you're far ahead of where you were when you were born. That's really the only way I can answer your question. And since you are a freshman at Harvard, I just want my nephew over here as a freshman. I just thought I could make a little,
Good evening. I have a question regarding the global environment and global culture as well. The two things which concern me the most, pretty much in the world, have to do with the fact that you alluded to the idea that the ethnic catastrophe which we're facing is not really comparable to the ecological one. But I've also heard from many environmentalists the contrary. And I've also heard, I'm from Australia, and one of the really enormous issues is that since the deconstruction of very, very ancient systems of food production, which were ritualized into all sorts of different cultures, that we've actually lost the capacity to interact effectively with our environment. And there was a statistic released recently that we're undergoing a rate of global desertification, which is faster than any point in geological history. So my question is really that, given that, how can we ever really expect human culture to be able to survive, given the fact that you can't reconstruct a dream? And also, secondly, how can we actually ever... Is it actually perhaps true to assume that our civilization has destroyed the Earth because we have no longer any... Our environment will outrun us?
Well, first of all, I wasn't trying in any... It's sort of pointless to say that cultural diversity is more severe than biological loss. I mean, for years I spoke about the collapse of biological diversity because I was a botanist working in the Amazon. My point in making the comparison is simply to stress not that one is more severe than the other, but rather than take a look at the one that you haven't really thought about that much, which is language loss, and realize that it is indeed as severe as it is, and the comparison to species loss is, that's just, trying to make the point. I mean, there's no question we've had a huge impact on the Earth, but I think we also tend to be extremely impatient with the pace by which we can ameliorate things. I mean, I once was in the rainforests of Borneo with a friend of mine, Asik Nialik, headman of the Ubong River Penang, which is one of the last nomadic groups of the Penang. And we had been hunting in the morning, it had been pouring rain, and the head of a sandbar deer roasted in the coals at our feet, and suddenly the clouds lit up, and we were sitting by this fire, and suddenly a full moon shone through the canopy. And a Sikh looked to me, and he looked to the moon, and he looked to me, and he said, "Is it true your people have been there?" And I said, "Yeah, we actually have been there." He said, "Well, what kind of canoe did you take? How long did it take you to get there? Why did you go? And is it true you brought back nothing but rock and dust?" Well, it was hard to explain to a man who kindled fire with flint a space program that consumed the wealth of nations and catapulted 12 men a collective several million miles through space, or the fact that they indeed came back with nothing but rock and dust, 828 pounds altogether. And I never really had an answer for a Sikh's query until one day I was at church service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., right across the street from where we live. And in the National Cathedral, one of the stained glass windows, called the space window, has a small bit of the moon in it. And if you know the Gothic tradition, those windows are decorative. In the Gothic tradition, the windows, the stained glass windows, were the boundary between the realm of the mundane and the sacred luminosity of God. And the idea was that as the light came through the stained glass window, it bathed the devotees in the stunning space of the cathedral. So these windows aren't trivial. And as I looked up at this window, which is a contemporary window created by some incredible artist, incredibly beautiful swirls of purples and red lights, all bringing your eye to this piece of black, inert, dead material, which was the moon. I suddenly realized I finally had an answer to a Sikh's question. We didn't go to space to acquire new wealth, but to acquire a new vision of life itself. And the seminal moment happened not when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon in July of 1969, but the previous Christmas Eve, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon and emerged, and for the first time in human history, we saw not a moonrise or a sunrise, but an earthrise. And in that kind of crystal moment, the whole paradigm shifted. And suddenly we saw not that the earth was a limitless frontier, or we didn't see the stunning products of human imagination. We saw a finite sphere floating in the velvet void of space. And I promise you that 1,000 years from now, when they look back to this era, they won't remember the technological innovations or even the wars, or even, you name it, that moment is going to be remembered as a moment when everything began to shift. And you can trace from that moment, which is it's not even 50 years ago, a whole new attitude towards the environment. I mean, Gary Snyder, do you know the poetry of Gary Snyder? Well, you should. He's wonderful. He was the man that Jack Kerouac wanted to be. And if you read the Dharma Bums, he's the central figure that Kerouac was writing about. But he was a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, and he really is an inspirational figure. And when I was about your age, I made a pilgrimage to his cabin in the Sierra Nevada in California, burst in on him and spewed apologies. And he said, anyone who can find me deserves to be here. And we spent a day together, and he's an extraordinary poet. And he said that in the 1950s, he would hitchhike across America just to have dinner with someone to whom he could relate. So you see, things have changed incredibly quickly. 40 years ago, not only were we not throwing garbage out of windows, we didn't even have any notion of biodiversity or biosphere. Those very terms were, if anything, part of the restricted vernacular of scientists. Now they're part of the vocabulary of school children. And will never again, there's no government on earth that can dismiss environmental concerns. It's pretty astonishing that has happened within a mere generation. And that's one of the reasons I coined this term ethnosphere, as really the idea being, let's get an organizing principle out there that people can begin to kind of think about. With the National Geographic, I got this hilarious call from the lawyers one day because the term ethnosphere had turned up on some radio broadcast, and they wanted to know if I wanted to copyright it and sue. And I said, are you out of your minds? That's the whole point. The whole point is to get this term out there so that 20 years from now, no one will know who coined this term, but it'll be on the lips of school children. So you must be patient, and things are actually getting a whole lot better. They really are.
Thank you very much.
Wade, first of all, I want to thank you for a very inspiring, informative lecture that you gave. And it kind of led me to some questions in my own mind. I spent some time in Australia, and I spent some time traveling in Africa. And I got to spend a week out with an Aboriginal tribe, and I got to go out in the outskirts of Africa. And in doing so, you notice how much Western culture, which kind of synonymous with commodities and with capitalism and like Coca-Cola signs everywhere, even in the border of Tanzania, just everywhere you go, and you see that these like our Western culture basically is almost synonymous with commodities, and then you see in Australia where basically the colonization of the country, the language was taken away from the people, and they were alienated as other and given a new language, and they weren't able to basically express the environment around them. With basically Western society infiltrating all these areas, it's hard to be an isolationist. You really cannot isolate yourself as a culture. So in doing so, many of the Aboriginal Australians and other people of those countries had to assimilate and go into society. And in doing so, you